new, I'm Nina. This is a storytelling lesson for high schoolers. When I say storytelling, I mean learning how to craft a story for the purposes of being told out loud. So that's what we're looking at. That's what we're dealing with. I'm just getting everything else set up. Yeah. So last week, basically we're just going to build on each week. And last week we talked about narrative structure, giving our stories beginning, middles, and endings, so that we can really play around within that format. And one of the ways that I think we play the most is with characters. And I mentioned this last week that this would be the direction we're heading in. So today's lesson is on characters. There are many different ways, right, of dealing with characters, particularly in written work and spoken story. And I think when we think of the latter of verbal storytelling and character, we think about impression. Specifically, I'm thinking of that the relationship to a character impacts you. That can require a little bit more nuance. So we're going to look at two stories from The Moth today. One is, unfortunately, there isn't a video, so it's just audio. So you're going to watch me listen to it with you. And the other is a video. And these stories deal with other characters, right? The first two stories we listened to last week definitely had characters, and they sort of served as part of the action, sometimes very directly, right? Last week we discussed a story in which somebody gets their car hijacked. So obviously the person who hijacks their car is directly involved in the events of the story. But here we're going to see how somebody's internal landscape can affect someone else more, and how you maybe craft that and build a narrative around it. So we'll listen to the first story, which is called How the Other Half Lives. Okay. One technical.
It's the summer of 2003. I had just finished my first year at Mount Holyoke College, and I was now beginning a summer job as a box office manager in Sharon, Connecticut. And I'd be living in the dorms with everybody who worked there backstage. And this dorm, it was a small house, but more like a cabin. And when you walked in, the first thing you'd notice was that it smelled like cigarette smoke, and that the floors were lined with empty beer bottles, or what they would call empties. And I'm not really a partier. I never was. I was always an old soul, and I was honestly more busier being Armenian than having any time for drinking drugs or anything else. So I was 19, and I decided that I wanted to see how the other half lived. So within my first week of work, I drank for the first time, I smoked pot for the first time, and I lost my virginity to the guy who operated the sound booth.
So very quickly, I want to build on our lesson last week and talk about the narrative structure of the piece also, and how she does a really good job moving through the exposition of the piece really quickly. She gives us a lot of information we need to know about her as a character, right? That she was apologies everyone. That's my assistant teacher, Chubbs. So that she was Armenian from this family, that she didn't live a certain lifestyle, that she hadn't partied, and now she is going to explore that option. And then she introduces this new character who is the guy she lost her virginity to. So all of that gets done really quickly. That's our exposition, right? That leads us into the beginning, the rising action of her piece of her story. A note how she introduces characters and how her character work exists outside of impression.
And so I now had a boyfriend, kind of, and had also earned myself the nickname Tequila. But But since I didn't have a big group of friends at the time to get advice from or ask questions to, I was kind of figuring things out on my own. Like, is it normal that my body hurts this much still afterwards? Or is it normal that he's not talking to me that much now, as much as he did? Or is it normal that my throat feels like I have a lump in it all the time? And if so, then how much of their sadness do women typically express, as as opposed as opposed to the amount that they keep inside and forget about? So. So after a while, I just couldn't take it anymore. And one weekend when I was visiting my parents and my family at their summer home, which was a couple of towns away from Sharon, I see my reflection in the porch window, and I start to sob. And my uncle, who's sitting a couple feet away from me in a wicker couch, looks over and says, "Are you all right?" And I just ran away, and I swung open the porch door, and I run down the stairs, down the hill, and as I'm running down, relatives are running up, and I bump shoulders with my dad. And my dad and I look at each other, and he looks at me, and he goes, "What's wrong?" And I said, "Oh, nothing." And he looks at me again, and since my dad has this way of just being able to read me really well, he said, "Oh, you had sex." And I didn't know what to say because I mean, I wasn't planning on discussing it with my parents, but but my parents are really cool, but they're also Armenian, and my dad is also from Lebanon, so you never know. And so I look at him and I go, "Yeah," and he goes, "Did you use a condom?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah." And so he kind of pats me on the shoulder, like in a welcome aboard kind of way. And 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 says, "Okay." And I immediately felt better because now I could stop feeling guilty and mad at myself and just feel sad the normal way. And later that night, everybody was going home. Like my uncles and aunts all went home, and my dad went home, and it was just me, my mom, and my little brother Rafi, who was 10 at the time. And my mom somehow found out, and she lights a cigarette and she sits me down and she says, "What the hell were you thinking?" And my mom has a way of coming on really strong till you realize that it's just her way of fighting for you. And she eventually just says, "I just don't know why you never look out for your heart." And and I say, "Mom, who looks out for their hearts anymore?" And, and she says, "You know what? I think you should invite him over for dinner. I think you should invite him over for dinner to have dinner with me and Rafi. I think it would be fun." And I said, "What?" And she said, "Yes, this is who you are. If someone's going to like you, they have to love all sides of you. Don't you dare minimize yourself or somebody else." And and so I don't know what it was. Maybe it was my inner Mount Holyokeness or my inner Armenian. And I looked at her and I said, "Okay." So so I next day I go to the sound booth and I said, "Look, I know we're not getting married or anything, but my mom wants to know if you want to come over and have dinner with her and my little brother." And he goes, "Okay," and I go, "Okay." Oh God. And then and so I'm setting the table for the most unnecessary meal of the century. And my mom is in the other room, like cooking a very elaborate meal. And I'm like saying, "Mom, why did you roast an entire chicken? He doesn't even love me." And I look through the window and I see his green Subaru drive up, and I hear the door slam shut, and I'm just like ready. And he walks in, and we sit down, and everything's fine. My mom and him talk about bands that they both like, and my brother talks to him about instruments he wants to learn how to play. But something happens because my brother, who's 10, he's too young to know what's going on, but he kind of knows what's going on. And he gives me this look from across the table. It's kind of like, "Interesting evening, huh?" And and I just start laughing, and I start laughing and laughing and laughing, and it's noticeable. And But I'm just so happy because I finally have my voice back, and I realized that you can have a lot of courage to run away from home and to try new things, but it takes twice the amount of courage to be able to come back, and and I realized that he wasn't the special guest that my mother invited to dinner that night. That special guest was me.
Okay. Thank you guys for bearing with me. So that's a story that's not really about the other characters, right? It's about the speaker and the journey that they take. The narrative structure is about them coming back to themselves. And the beginning is them realizing that they want to try new things. They want to see how the other half lives. The middle is that period where they find themselves very unhappy about it. That's sort of the climax of the piece. And at the end, we have this notion of her being invited to this dinner. So it's a story about the speaker, but it is entirely formed by and informed by the cast around her, the cast of characters. Right away, she tells you about her family and the guy she lost her virginity to, and there's an inherent comparison there. But I want to note that although she's creating these characters and giving us the situation where they clashed, there's no impression, right? At no point does she tell you even what they sound like. So how does she build these characters for her story to revolve around? I think it is achieved by speaking to her experiences and relations about these people, right? Rather than telling you too much about them, she tells you about her feelings about them. So for example, even with her father, we get this background information, Armenian from Lebanon, but it's more that she says, so you never know. And that tells us a lot about him. How strict he is, how understanding he is, the unpredictability of that when she talks about her mother, and she says she comes on really strong, but you realize it's for you. This idea of this is her experience of these people, including of the guy she loses her virginity to. Correct? Yeah, he exists in her experience of him. But by giving us her experiences of all of these people, she enables us to go on the journey of coming back to herself. And in life, I would say often when we go through an experience that leads us back to ourselves, it is the result of interactions with other people. So when we're telling a story, we want to think about how other people influence the action of the story. In last week's piece, The Bad Haircut, it's that very obvious influence, right? Of the cousin gives him a bad haircut. But in this piece, in How the Other Half Lives, it's much more about how the character is emotionally met by everybody she interacts with, right? The journey is hers, impacted by the characters around her. And I think for that reason, impression would not be as helpful here, because it may make a decision for us or turn something comedic that has a real depth to it. And by not leaning into that, she manages to achieve comedy on her own end without using any of the characters for it. I would argue the closer she gets to impression is when she is imitating herself, right? Imitation, I guess, is a better word also than impression. The closest she gets to imitating anybody is sort of heightened versions of her own reactions to things, you know, like, he doesn't even love me, stuff like that. And I think what's cool about storytelling as a performative medium is that you get to contrast yourself against your characters, or your characters against each other, or two characters simply against each other against you. And a lot of that is done in how you choose to represent them verbally. And I think it is important to note in this piece how many characters appear that influence our speaker, and yet the sort of delicate hand she treats creating them with. It's much more about in relation to her and her experience of them, because it's part of this larger journey. And that's not always true. Sometimes the story is about the characters, as we're going to see in the next piece. It's a good example. The next piece, which is called Stranger Bonding, we don't learn that much about the speaker. We don't go on the same narrative structure, inner journey with them. It's a good example of a story that revolves around an incident with characters. So let's check that one out. Luckily, this one's a video, so you don't have to just watch me watch it. Okay.
Wendy Spiro.
So last year, I received a totally last minute random wedding invitation from an acquaintance from my sociology class in college. We had not spoken in like 10 years. I didn't know anyone going, but I'm really into people watching and it was local and there's always good people watching at weddings. So I decided I would go. And the reception was really large and fancy. And I was seated at table 31 with 11 other equally miscellaneous seeming guests. And as we all discussed how little we knew the couple, I was confident that we were all on the same page, thinking the same thing. And the fact that Jane and Rob had considered us important enough to be part of this special day suggested a skewed understanding of human relationships in general, and a probable separation within the year. Across from me, right, is this very good-looking blonde guy with fabulous dimples, about 23 years old, and he is seated next to this equally good-looking guy with equally Nordic coloring, about the same age. And I noticed that the two start to snuggle and kiss, and I am pleased because they make this excruciatingly gorgeous couple. But within minutes, the hugging and kissing devolves, right, into public displays of affection from another universe. They are literally like entwined. They are licking, dressing off each other's palms. They are tickling one another's neck and armpits with arugula. Swear to God. And we're all like, and we're trying to like chat and eat normally, but it's impossible to focus on anything other than the PDA. And in an effort to break the madness, this 40-ish woman sitting next to me turns to them and is like, so how do you guys know Rob and Jane? Cousins, said the dimple guy. Oh, how nice. So you are the cousin? We are the cousins. Silence. Intense silence. So clarification is desperately needed. So I take it upon myself to add, so that makes you guys also cousins to each other. No, says the other guy. Massive sigh of relief. We're twins. We are Jane's cousins. And I just think it does not get better than this. But then it did, because as I look around at the other members of this fabulous table 31, I feel instant camaraderie. And when the woman next to me excuses herself to go to the bathroom, it was like understood that the rest of us would follow. And we go and we form a huddle by the bathroom. And between hysterical laughter, we ponder the important questions. What the fuck? Are we on camera? Does the family know? And I'm writhing in excitement. I'm like, oh my God. And I like march back into the reception and I go to the bride and groom and I'm like, hey, love this wedding. So those cousins of yours, they are your cousins. And she's like, yes, the twins. How hot are they? Oh my God. So glad you like everyone. It's like, right. And I run back and I confirm that the blondes are indeed relatives of the bridal party and relatives to one another. Our plan is to return and add probing yet non-judgmental sounding questions. But when we return to the table, right, the twins are gone. They are nowhere to be seen. Their jackets are gone. And we just sit there and nibble at our food while analyzing the insanity of it all. And after the cake is clear, it was like the cake was clear and it was like time to go at the end of the wedding. And it was like kind of difficult to say goodbye to the people. And I was like, well, you know, nice meeting you guys. Love sharing those moments with you. And although we had barely exchanged names, we then spent like 40 minutes exchanging email addresses on Jane and Rob embossed napkins. No one actually planned on keeping in touch, I think, but we had to go through the motions because after watching ridiculously good-looking male twins passionately make out, we had become a tight-knit family. Sometimes people do not believe me when I tell the story. And that is so frustrating, but it is fundamentally okay because the other members of Table 31 were there. They were right there with me. Together, we saw one brother tuckle another brother with arugula. And I trust that although we will never speak again, our bond continues to be just as strong as it was that very humid day in June.
So thank you guys again for bearing with me. Sorry, sometimes I'm a little technically behind. So like I said, this is a really good story that revolves around incident with characters rather than sort of an inner emotional journey around characters, although we certainly go for quite the wild emotional ride. But the narrative structure of the story really revolves around sort of at this wedding, don't know anyone, at this miscellaneous table, rising action, these two people are kissing and behaving somewhat inappropriately. And then the climax is we are the cousins, right? And then from there, it's all about resolving it. It's about trying to figure out what the heck is going on. And I would argue that the resolution is really this idea of being bonded by that experience. And again, although this is a very comedic story, the storyteller does not rely on imitation or impression in the same way that John Mulaney does. It's really her reaction to things that creates the insanity of them. And that's certainly a choice, and I think it's an effective one here, and is also true in the previous story, which is this idea of, in storytelling, we tell the audience more about what to think about a person or an event based on our reaction to that. If we react like it's nothing, they will react like it's nothing. If we react like it's a big deal, they will react like it's a big deal. And I think the storyteller does that incredibly effectively. She also makes the choice, although there are many other people at the table, to use them more as a group sounding board than get really specific about anybody. She tells us some general information that all of them don't really know the bride and groom. But it's possible that there were a myriad of sort of odder characters at that table with her. But she wanted to highlight the true dramatic event, which is these twins. And so to do that, she sort of creates like a chorus of other guests at table 31. I think that's very different than in How the Other Half Lives, where we're given a lot of characters, including an uncle who shows up for a line and disappears. And I think that's because in How the Other Half Lives, the person being most highlighted is the speaker and the journey they're going on. So they give themselves more people to react to so that we can go on that exploration with them. Whereas here, we're just given these two characters and the bride for a moment, but really, again, she's just speaking to the other two characters. So it's worth thinking in your own story, who are the most important characters and how can you highlight them, right? In Stranger Bonding, she does so by just giving us these characters and everyone else's reaction to them, including her own. In How the Other Half Lives, it's much more spread out cast. But it's still sort of focused in, right, on the brother, the father, the mother, and some semi-boyfriend. So in your story, there might be many, 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 many people involved in it. But who really moves the plot? Who guides you through the narrative structure? And that might be because, like in How the Other Half Lives, they are integral to the journey and the experience. And it might be, as in Stranger Bonding, that they are the journey and the experience, that the whole story revolves around the interaction with them. So last week I said, basically, I would recommend having 3 ideas you're playing with, 3 story ideas, and giving them a narrative structure, giving them the beginning, the middle, and the end. Now, I would suggest you go to those stories and ask yourself, who are my characters? How many are there? Which ones are the most important? And then start looking for the ways that you can draw attention to or create the story around these characters in a way that serves your dramatic structure of the piece, right? And I know that looking at your stories in this way can feel a little tedious, but I think it's important because once you develop an instinct for structure and for characters, you don't have to pull your story apart in the same way. You don't have to sort of create the math problem of it. Once you can look at a story like Stranger Bonding and say, like, okay, it's really about the twins. They need to be the most important thing in this. I need to highlight everyone else's response to them, my response to them. Or whereas in something like How the Other Half Lives, if you say, like, okay, well, ultimately, I, the speaker, am the person who is motivating the action of the piece. So I need to give myself things to play against more than I need to create a reaction. Or if you're doing something more akin to what John Mulaney does, and you're just trying to give us a sense of this character, then maybe something like impression imitation is right. Yeah? Because John Mulaney, that whole piece, once you take a look at it, it really is saying, just look at this person. Just look at how insane this was. This is who taught us safety training for my school. And to do that, he reflects himself as sort of the voice of common reason against this insanity. Whereas in Stranger Bonding, the characters who are responsible for sort of the insanity of the story are very common and reasonable, and they are met with these large reactions, which gives the audience permission to have these large reactions. And both of those are, I would say, funny stories, or akin to stand-up. So all of which is to say, there's the tedious aspect of looking at your 3 stories and getting very specific about the characters. And that is certainly a more technical approach. But once you've isolated them, there is so much room to explore and to play and to get really strange and then pull back and to perform around these people. And I think that is one of the things that I really value about storytelling as an oral tradition, is how much playing you get to do with your characters, that maybe when you're writing, you have to be a little bit more sort of academically detailed about how to explain them to people. And here you really get to play with the fun of creating the character. And creating a character, as we've seen in just these 3 examples, can look very different. You can get very specific about what they look like, where they're from, what they do, or you can get very specific about the way that they speak, or you can get very specific about the actions that they take and the situation you're in. So again, I encourage you to look at your 3 pieces, look at the characters in those pieces, and know that for each piece, you might have an entirely different way of approaching your character. The point is, much like in how we need to be specific with the narrative structure, we need to be specific with our characters. I think we've all been on the receiving end of stories where at the end we can't keep everybody who was in it straight. And one mark of successful storytelling is when it ends and you know who was in this story and who achieved what end of the story, who played what part. So I really encourage you, look at your 3 stories, find their characters, find how they serve the plot. And as we're doing this, as I said last week, it's possible that one of your stories will fall by the wayside. It will no longer feel as rich as you thought it was, or just for right now, and that's fine. Go with the piece that is revealing itself to you. That when you sit down to look at it, the characters come forth, the narrative structure comes forth. These things reveal themselves, and then you can play with them. So I encourage you to do that. Next week, we're going to look at setting the scene. So we've discussed how to give our stories an arc. Now we've discussed how to find the key characters and different ways of really highlighting them. So next week, we're going to discuss taking all of these things and setting the scenes that they're in. And much like how our first week stories did have characters, scenes are set all over these stories. But we'll focus on pieces that really, really rely on putting their listener where the piece is occurring. Much like how these stories really, really rely on us getting a sense of the people who the storyteller is dealing with in action to, or in reaction to. So start to think about that for your pieces, but that is next week's focus. For this week, really just sit down, and to help you get started, here are some questions that I always ask myself about characters in work, either written or spoken, which is, what do they sound like? And does my audience need to know that? What are their physical descriptors? And then, what is the simplest physical descriptor I can give so that the audience gets it? Because we often don't have that much time. So for example, is it most important that I note that this person's really tall? Does that affect the story? If I have to look up at them every time I'm speaking to them, is that something that the audience should know? Versus, if they have a lot of hair. And maybe the fact that they're really tall and have a lot of hair is relevant, but one is more relevant. So getting very specific with your characters and then seeing what really feeds the plot. And in terms of a physical description. Then I think also the ability to get rid of characters, as we saw in Stranger Bonding, sort of amalgamize a group into a chorus of reaction is a useful skill, because then you don't have to spend so much time explaining everybody. If she had gone around the table and explained every single person they were with, I don't think the story would have had the same impact. I think it was a really, really great storytelling choice to jump in to the most interesting parts of it. And again, the only way you can do this is maybe by starting with a bigger cast of characters and realizing you have to cut down. So there's an experimental aspect to this, which is also why I suggest you're sort of playing with working on a few stories before committing to one, because you want to see which comes out in the strongest way. But I think it's very important to note, in addition to all of these ideas about building character, how in your story, is the story about the characters, or is the story about the speaker's reaction to the characters, or something the characters do? Because those are two different ways of requiring things from your character. I would say in How the Other Half Lives, it's much more about the way that the speaker reacts to the characters in their inner life. Versus in Stranger Bonding, it's much more about this sort of immediate reaction to what these people are doing. So consider that, and remember that there's nothing wrong if imitation seems like it is the best way to reveal something about your character. John Mulaney does an incredible job with imitation. And I really recommend to watch that whole stand-up because he does several different ones and they're great. It's just about the effect. It's just about what you want to achieve with your story. And for today, I want to leave everybody with that, with the fact that everything we're doing, building the narrative structure, the piece, the dramatic structure, finding the characters, it's to help you say what you want to say and tell the audience what you want to tell them about your story. It's about storytelling and about how you are the best person to tell your story. So take the week, think about your characters, think about how they serve your narrative structure. And next week, we will talk about where everybody is, the rooms that they are, the countries they are, whatever will suit your story. And we're going to talk about how to build the world of it. So I'm looking forward to next week. I hope everybody stays safe and happy. And thank you so much for tuning in.